Well, it's hard to say I'm sorry, even when the guilt rests firmly on your shoulders. But the British bank HSBC has gotten pretty good at it lately after a string of money laundering allegations turned out to be true. The bank, a global financial leader, has a rap sheet that would send any average American to life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Just in the past couple of years, HSBC has been working hand in hand with Mexican drug cartels, accepting and exchanging billions of dollars of blood-drenched money. It has conducted business with Iran, over 25,000 transactions and counting that we know of, and has also handled the finances for Cuba, Syria, Libya, and several other nations despite international sanctions against the countries. What's more, for years after the 9/11 terror attacks that took the lives of thousands, including 67 Brits, HSBC had a partnership with the Al Rajhi Bank. It's a Saudi bank that has ties to al-Qaeda and is part of Osama bin Laden's so-called golden chain. It also supported some of the 9/11 hijackers. And most recently, the bank is accused of predatory and discriminatory lending practices against minorities here in the United States. But while the federal government might be reluctant to punish megabanks like this, 3 counties in Georgia are fighting back, actually suing the bank for allegedly costing them hundreds of millions of dollars in expenses and damages to their tax bases by aggressively signing minority borrowers to housing loans that the bank knew the people wouldn't be able to pay back. It's a case that could set a precedent for how banks that engage in predatory lending will be dealt with in the future. So to talk more about HSBC's not-so-secret scheming, I'm joined now by Kyle Harrington, founder and managing partner of Harrington Capital Management. Hi there, Kyle. So let's start off by talking about these counties in Atlanta. What are they suing for, and what can really come out of all of this?
Well, I think the following, right? Any predatory or wanton approach to lending practices associated with individuals, it cannot go without punishment. And I know that we're all responsible for reading our documents and putting together our financial statements in a way and making sure we've read all of the footnotes, as well as dotting all the I's and crossing the T's. But if in any way there was a Machiavellian approach or deceptive approach to these lending practices and these counties in Atlanta, then there is a case to make that this was done by the bank. And let's face it, you just outlined this. HSBC has had a reputational situation over the last few years with the Mexican cartels and with this al-Qaeda situation. So it would not surprise me that the bank would go down this path. And if in fact they did, then these lawsuits have merit to them.
So Kyle, talk about these predatory lending practices. How did they target minorities in these instances?
Well, I mean, they can go to the minority areas in the Atlanta base and start whetting the appetite of these people with respect to loans that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to get. And maybe for the first 2 years, these loans are below market interest rates, but what they don't highlight is that in the 3rd or 4th or 5th year, Megan, the rate balloons up to a significantly higher rate, that these individuals can no longer afford their mortgages or properties that they own. And so therefore a foreclosure process happens, and that costs these local state governments monies to foreclose on properties and go through the process of collecting the properties that they have loans against, and then you see the process just unfolds in a very negative way for everybody. So I think they target them maybe because they think that they're not going to read the footnotes and look at all the paperwork with a very perceptive eye, and as a result they sign the paperwork and the loan goes through, and then here we are 2 or 3 years later and they no longer can afford to pay the mortgages that they have on the properties that they own.
And I've also heard that the people that are borrowers that can afford to have these loans, that this bank was actually driving them into even more expensive loans that they knew they wouldn't be able to pay off. So let me ask you this. Why is the federal government letting bygones be bygones, so now that it's up to localities that they have to fend for themselves?
Well, I think that, it's going to be on the states in particular, where these loans were made. But I think at some point, and like I said, I am one that believes in the responsibility of one's own financial income statement and balance sheet, and that you do have to read the documents before you sign anything. But I think the federal government's going to have to step in here and take a closer look at exactly any fraud or deceptive measures that have maybe taken place here with respect to the banks in those specific counties.
Now, what we're also seeing with as far as going with trading with Iran and working deals with Cuba and Mexican drug cartels, the bank has agreed to a settlement of $1.9 billion as retribution for working with these cartels, etc. That amount of money is being described as a historic amount. I want you to listen to this, and then I'll get your opinion.
One of the world's largest banks, HSBC, has agreed to make the biggest payment in history in a settlement over money laundering.
Instead, it's agreed to pay a record $1.9 billion fine to settle the case.
But today, the bank agreed to pay a record amount to the United States government, nearly $2 billion.
Does that excuse what they have done? Morally, maybe not. Financially, they say, and the feds here in this country and the Department of Justice say they are paying their dues.
So a historic payoff. Now, $1.9 billion might seem like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that much, Kyle. I mean, $1.92 billion settlement is in response to $60 trillion in unmonitored transactions. So we did a little research of our own, and we found out that this is how it would compare to an average American salary. We found that this means they paid $1.60 for every $50,000 that they turned their cheek on. So that's more or less, that's less than a slap on the wrist, am I right?
Oh, yeah, big time. I mean, you know, what that tells me, Megan, is the following: that they're guilty, that they know that they've gotten their hand caught in the cookie jar, and that they're willing to settle for an amount of money. However, it sounds egregious in nature, like you highlighted, for a bank to pay that amount. But based on the amount that that might have been at risk, or fraudulent amounts, that seems as if you just highlighted it. I mean, you know, $1.60 on 50,000 is actually a lot less than a little tiny slap on the wrist. So my guess is that this is how they settled in an effort to avoid a very disastrous run on the bank and run on the stock.
Now, here's another question I have to ask you. Mitt Romney, the Supreme Court, and others have said time and again that corporations are people. But if that's the case, why isn't this mega bank corporation being punished like you or I would be? And what would happen, like, to me, for instance, if I did the things that HSBC has admitted to?
Oh, yeah, you know, and even in my business at Harrington Capital Management, you know, we're dotting I's and crossing T's more than ever because of increased scrutiny in the regulatory environment. And it's disenchanting to see a major bank like this run into issues this major and not have a more heightened scrutiny or punishment level than they've already had. So it's disenchanting, Megan, in a big way.
Let me ask you very quickly, we only have about 15 seconds left, but if it was up to you, how would you see HSBC punished?
Well, I think that there has to be fines levied against the bank that are much more egregious in nature, and I want to make sure that the people that were at risk of being, defrauded get paid back every single dime that they put at risk, and then some. That would, to me, be, a satisfactory result.
All right, Kyle Harrington, founder of the Harrington Capital Management. Thank you so much for your time and your opinion, sir.
Happy holidays, Megan.